November 14th, 2024, 9:47 p.m. Celestia Rooftop Restaurant, downtown Chicago. 9 words scrawled on a cocktail napkin would destroy the illusion of safety that Diana Koontz had maintained for 3 months. What she overheard at table 16 would force her to confront a truth she had spent her entire employment denying. The man who tipped 20% and ordered his martini bone dry wasn't a businessman, he was a predator, and someone had just sold him to a bigger one. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The dining terrace on Celestia's 42nd floor sat suspended above Michigan Avenue, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that turned Chicago's skyline into a glittering cage. On the evening of November 14th, 2024, the space hummed with the familiar rhythm of wealthy patrons and desperate servers. Diana Koontz's Thursday night shift had become a ritual of managed survival. At precisely 9:47 p.m., while clearing champagne flutes from table 15, Diana heard a voice that would fundamentally alter how she understood the restaurant where she'd worked for 3 months. The man at table 16, the one with the scar running from his left ear to his jawline, leaned toward his companion with the careful posture of someone accustomed to not being overheard. His voice barely rose above the ambient jazz piano, but Diana was close enough to catch every syllable. Bravetti doesn't know the Volkovas already own him. By midnight tomorrow, he's their property. Diana's hand froze mid-reach. The champagne flute tilted. Crystal clinked against porcelain with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire terrace. Both men turned to stare. The scarred man, Matteo Grimshaw, had been shadowing Curtis Bravetti for weeks. Diana had memorized the pattern. Matteo arrived 15 minutes before Curtis, scanned the terrace with the systematic attention of a man checking for threats, then positioned himself one table away with clear sightlines to the elevator and emergency stairs. She'd assumed he was a bodyguard. She'd never questioned why a businessman needed one. Curtis Bravetti occupied table 17 every Thursday at 8 o'clock sharp. Diana knew his order without asking. Bone-dry martini, 3 olives, ribeye medium rare, no conversation beyond thank you and the check. He tipped exactly 20%, paid in cash, and always watched the door. For 3 months, Diana had told herself he was just another wealthy regular. Chicago had plenty of men in expensive suits who moved through the world with that particular quality of stillness, as if they existed half a step removed from normal consequences. She'd convinced herself that not knowing was the same as not being involved. By 10 o'clock p.m., Diana had retreated to the service station, her hands trembling as she polished wine glasses she'd already polished twice. The scarred man's words played on repeat in her mind. By midnight tomorrow, he's their property. She knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the man at table 17 wasn't named Johnson or Williams or any of the other forgettable names wealthy men used when they wanted privacy. His name was Curtis Bravetti, and when Matteo said it, he'd spoken with the particular inflection people use when referring to someone everyone should know. Second, the Volkovas were not a business consulting firm or a private equity group. The way Matteo's companion had smiled when he mentioned them, cold and satisfied, suggested something far more dangerous. Third, and most terrifying, Diana now possessed information that could get her killed. Because in the 60 seconds since that champagne flute clinked against porcelain, Matteo Grimshaw had not looked away from her once. Head server Marcus Chen appeared at her elbow with the careful casualness of someone who'd worked at Celestia long enough to recognize when a colleague was spiraling. "You good?" he asked, voice low. Diana nodded without conviction. Through the glass partition separating the service station from the dining terrace, she could see Curtis Bravetti reviewing his check. He would leave in approximately 7 minutes, following the same pattern he'd maintained for 12 consecutive Thursdays. He would stand, button his suit jacket, and walk to the elevator with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. And tomorrow at midnight, according to Matteo's whispered conversation, Curtis Brevetti would discover he was wrong. The moral calculus happened faster than Diana expected. She was 26 years old, working double shifts to pay off debts her father had accumulated before his death 6 months earlier. The loan shark who came to collect every month, Rourke Tannen, had made it clear what happened to people who missed payments. Diana had learned to keep her head down, serve her tables, and pretend not to notice when dangerous men conducted dangerous business in her section. But Curtis Brevetti had never been cruel. He'd never made inappropriate comments or deliberately complicated her job the way some wealthy patrons did for sport. He'd existed in her world for 3 months as a ghost of wealth and silence, and while she didn't know him, she couldn't let him walk into an ambush without warning. At 9:54 p.m., Diana made her choice. She pulled a cocktail napkin from the stack beside the espresso machine and wrote 9 words in handwriting that betrayed her terror. "Your bodyguard betrayed you. You are the payment." The walk to table 17 felt like crossing a minefield. Matteo Grimshaw tracked her movement with the focus of a predator watching prey step into range. Curtis was signing his credit card receipt when Diana set down the check presenter containing her napkin. "Thank you for dining with us, Mr. Brevetti," she said, voice steadier than she'd expected. Curtis looked up. His eyes were the color of winter slate, and for the first time in 3 months, they focused on her completely. His gaze dropped to the check presenter. His fingers, elegant and scarred across the knuckles, lifted the leather folder. Diana didn't wait to see him read it. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen with measured steps, feeling Matteo's attention burning into her spine like a targeting laser. Behind her, Curtis Brevetti sat motionless at table 17, a folded cocktail napkin in his hand, and the weight of impossible betrayal settling over him like volcanic ash. The choice Diana made in those 7 seconds, between 9:54 p.m. and 10:01 p.m. on November 14, 2024, would determine whether Curtis Brevetti lived or died. But more immediately, it determined whether Diana herself would survive until morning. Because in the world Curtis inhabited, a world Diana had just irrevocably entered, witnesses were liabilities, and liabilities were eliminated. To understand what Diana had stumbled into, and why a hastily scrawled warning would bind her fate to Chicago's most dangerous crime lord, one must first understand what she'd convinced herself to ignore. For 3 months, Diana had served a man whose very presence at Celestia violated every principle of criminal discretion. She told herself he was a businessman. She told herself the men watching him were colleagues. She told herself the tension that followed him like a shadow was simply the stress of high-stakes deals. But Curtis Brevetti wasn't a businessman. He was the man who controlled Chicago's South Side with a reputation built on strategic violence and absolute loyalty. And the loyalty he'd purchased with fear and money had just been sold to the highest bidder. Curtis Brevetti's fingers closed around the napkin with the same controlled precision he brought to every potentially lethal situation. 9 words in shaking handwriting. 9 words that confirmed what his instincts had been whispering for weeks, but his ego had refused to hear. He didn't look up, didn't scan the terrace for the waitress who'd delivered his execution notice. Instead, he observed Matteo through peripheral vision, cataloging micro-expressions the way a poker player reads tells. Matteo's left hand had moved to his phone twice in the past 30 seconds. His jaw muscles were tight. His eyes tracked the waitress's retreat with the focus of a predator calculating strike distance. The handwriting told Curtis everything he needed to know about authenticity. The letters slanted right under pressure, ink pooling where the pen had pressed too hard. This wasn't a setup. This was terror transcribed onto cloth napkin by someone who understood she'd just signed her own death warrant to save his. Curtis stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the elevator with the unhurried confidence of a man whose night had proceeded exactly as planned. Matteo would be watching for panic, for deviation from pattern. Curtis gave him nothing. The illusion of control had just become his most valuable weapon. Behind the hostess stand, Diana's hands trembled so violently she dropped a wine list. Manager Richard Castellano appeared at her elbow, voice low and sharp. Get it together, Koontz. You look like you've seen a murder. Diana wanted to laugh. She hadn't seen one yet, but she'd just guaranteed at least two. Curtis Bravetti's if her warning failed, and her own for delivering it. Matteo Grimshaw hadn't looked away from her since the champagne flute incident. His attention felt physical, like crosshairs painted on her spine. Across the terrace, Matteo pulled out his phone and typed with deliberate calm, "Witness problem. Waitress knows." The response came within seconds. "Contain it." Matteo pocketed his phone and smiled at his dinner companion. Containing problems was, after all, what the Volkovas paid him for. 18 months of patient infiltration. 18 months of siphoning Curtis's accounts through shell companies layered so deep even forensic accountants needed weeks to trace them. 18 months of building a manufactured debt that would transfer Chicago's most dangerous crime lord into Volkova ownership like a foreclosed property. One terrified waitress wouldn't derail everything now. What Matteo didn't know, what nobody except a loan shark named Rourke Tannen knew, was that Diana Koontz's father had discovered the laundering route 6 months ago. Michael Koontz had been a compulsive gambler and a mediocre accountant, but he'd possessed one dangerous talent: pattern recognition. When Tannen's loan operation started processing unusually large cash deposits, Michael noticed. When those deposits matched withdrawal timelines from accounts Michael recognized as Bravetti subsidiaries, he'd made the fatal mistake of asking questions. His heart attack had been chemically induced. Tannen made sure of it. And Diana had been paying her father's manufactured debts ever since, never knowing the man collecting her money had ordered her father's execution. At 3 a.m., Curtis sat in his downtown office while Petra Voss, his accountant and one of 3 people he genuinely trusted, spread financial records across his desk like autopsy photos. 8 million, Petra said quietly. Siphoned over 18 months through 17 shell companies, then loaned back to you through Volkova intermediaries. On paper, you owe them your own fortune. Curtis studied the documentation with surgical focus. Every number confirmed what the napkin had warned. Matteo hadn't just betrayed him. Matteo had dismantled his empire from within with the patience of a cancer metastasizing through vital organs. At 3:47 a.m., Curtis summoned Matteo for what he called a routine security briefing. He watched his bodyguard's face as they discussed tomorrow's schedule. Watched the micro-expressions, the slight dilation of pupils when Curtis mentioned the Volkovas. The nearly imperceptible tension in jaw muscles when Curtis asked about financial audits. "Everything's secure, boss," Matteo said with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Curtis dismissed him with a nod and waited until the door closed before making his first call. 7 more followed. By 4:15 a.m., 30 men who owed Curtis debts that transcended money were mobilized. Some debts were paid in blood. Some in loyalty that couldn't be bought. Curtis was about to collect on all of them. His final instruction came at 4:23 a.m., delivered to his remaining loyal security team. "Find the waitress from Celestia. Dark hair, mid-20s, terrified. Her name tag said Diana. Bring her to the safe house on Wabash. Don't let Matteo's people get to her first." Because the woman who'd risked everything to save his life had just become the most important witness in Chicago. And in Curtis Bravetti's world, important witnesses either testified or disappeared. Curtis intended to make sure Diana did both. Diana's studio apartment had never felt smaller. She'd arrived home at 2:30 a.m., deadbolted the door, and stood in the darkness listening to Chicago's ambient noise with the hypervigilance of prey. Every car door slam became footsteps. Every distant siren became pursuit. The napkin she'd written had been white cloth. The line she'd crossed had been permanent. Sleep never came. By 6 a.m., Diana had convinced herself the danger was imaginary. By 8 a.m., she'd almost believed Curtis Bravetti would simply disappear from Celestia and her life would resume its familiar rhythm of debt payments and double shifts. By 10:30 a.m., desperate for normalcy, she'd grabbed her wallet and headed to the corner market for coffee and bread. The illusion of safety lasted exactly 47 minutes. At 11:17 a.m., Diana returned to find her apartment door ajar. Not broken, not forced, simply open, as if someone had been given a key or knew exactly how to bypass cheap locks without leaving evidence. Her first instinct was to run. Her second was to call the police. Her third, the one that overrode survival logic, was to push the door open because everything she owned in the world existed in that single room. Rourke Tannen sat at her kitchen table like he'd been invited. Two men flanked him, both wearing the kind of expensive casual clothing that suggested violence was a profession, not a hobby. Tannen smiled with the warmth of a loan shark who'd just found his debtor trying to flee. "Diana," he said pleasantly, "we need to discuss your poor decision-making." Diana's grocery bag slipped from her fingers. Apples rolled across the floor. She didn't move to retrieve them. Tannen gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit, we'll make this quick." "I don't know what you're talking about." Diana's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Table 16. Last night, you heard a conversation that wasn't meant for civilian ears." Tannen's smile faded. "The Volkovas don't appreciate loose ends. Your father learned that lesson 6 months ago when he started asking questions about money that didn't concern him. Heart attacks are wonderfully convenient, aren't they?" The words hit Diana like physical blows. Her father hadn't died naturally. The debts she'd been paying weren't his gambling losses. They were blackmail for a murder dressed up as natural causes. "You killed him," Diana whispered. "I facilitated his exit from a situation he didn't understand." Tannen stood, nodding to his enforcers. "Now I'm facilitating yours. Gentlemen, make it look like a robbery gone wrong." The two men moved with synchronized efficiency. Diana backed toward the door, but one of them was already there, blocking her exit. The other pulled a knife from his jacket with the casual comfort of someone who'd done this before. Then the door exploded inward. The enforcer blocking the exit went down first, tackled by 240 pounds of muscle moving with tactical precision. Diana recognized one of Curtis's bodyguards from Celestia, the younger one who always stood near the elevator. The second bodyguard came through behind him, and what followed was brief and absolutely brutal. No dramatic choreography, no extended struggle, just efficient violence executed by men trained to eliminate threats permanently. The enforcer with the knife managed one swing before his wrist snapped audibly. The other tried to draw a gun and received 3 rapid strikes that left him unconscious on Diana's floor. Tannen fled through the fire escape with the survival instinct of a man who recognized when a situation had turned. His footsteps echoed down the metal stairs, while Diana stood frozen, watching 2 bodies bleed onto her cheap carpet. The bodyguard secured the apartment with military efficiency, checking corners and windows before one of them spoke into a phone. "Clear. She's secure." 60 seconds later, Curtis Brevetti walked through Diana's broken door like he'd been expected. He surveyed the apartment with the assessing gaze of someone cataloging assets and liabilities. His eyes moved from the bodies to Diana, who stood trembling against her kitchen counter, to the scattered apples still rolling across the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You shouldn't be here anymore." Not a suggestion, a statement of fact. Diana Koontz's life in this apartment, in this neighborhood, in the version of Chicago where she pretended ignorance protected her, had just ended. Curtis gestured to his bodyguards. "Pack what she needs." "We leave in 5 minutes." Diana found her voice. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Curtis looked at her with something that might have been sympathy in a different man. In him, it looked like inevitability. "Miss Koontz, 2 men just tried to kill you in your own home. Rourke Tannen knows where you work, where you live, and that you're the reason I'm still breathing. You have 2 choices. Come with me and survive the next 48 hours, or stay here and become another convenient heart attack." He paused at the door, waiting. "It's not protection I'm offering, it's custody. But at least you'll be alive to resent me for it." Diana looked at the blood on her floor, the broken door, the life she'd tried so desperately to maintain now shattered as completely as the lock. Curtis Bravetti wasn't her savior. He was her only option. She grabbed her phone and followed him into the hallway, leaving everything else behind. Diana woke to unfamiliar silence. Not the urban symphony of her studio apartment, sirens, traffic, neighbors arguing through thin walls, but the hollow quiet of a space designed to exist outside normal Chicago. The safe house occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse on Wabash, insulated by steel doors and men with guns who nodded at Curtis and ignored her completely. She found him at 7:30 a.m. in what passed for a war room, surrounded by blueprints and satellite images of Chicago's waterfront. He looked up when she entered, assessing her the way he'd assessed the bodies in her apartment, cataloging damage, calculating utility. "Coffee's on the counter," he said. "Sugar's in the cabinet if you need it." The domesticity felt obscene given the circumstance. Diana poured herself a cup and sat across from him without invitation. "Explain it to me," she said. "All of it." Curtis set down the blueprint he'd been studying. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and Diana realized this was the first time they'd actually spoken beyond transactional restaurant exchanges. His eyes were gray in the morning light, cold and intelligent. "Matteo Grimshaw spent 18 months dismantling my organization," Curtis began. "He siphoned $8 million from my accounts, laundered it through shell companies, then loaned it back to me through Volkova intermediaries. On paper, I owe the Volkovas my own fortune. The contract is legally binding. If I don't pay by midnight tonight, I become their asset. Property to be managed, not a partner to be negotiated with." Diana's coffee had gone cold in her hands. "And you didn't notice?" "I noticed inefficiencies, missing shipments, accounts that didn't balance perfectly. But Matteo had 7 years of trust banked. I assumed incompetence, not betrayal." Curtis's jaw tightened. "That assumption almost cost me everything." The door opened and Petra Voss entered carrying a manila folder. She was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, dressed like an accountant who'd wandered into a crime syndicate by accident and decided to stay. She glanced at Diana with something that might have been sympathy. "She should know about her father," Petra said to Curtis. Diana set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "What about my father?" Petra opened the folder, spreading documents across the table. Bank statements, wire transfers. A coroner's report marked inconclusive. "Michael Koontz discovered Matteo's laundering route 6 months ago," Petra explained clinically. "He was processing loans for Rourke Tannen and noticed unusually large cash deposits that matched withdrawal timelines from Curtis's subsidiary accounts. When he started asking questions, Tannen had him killed, made it look like cardiac arrest induced by stress and gambling debts. The debts you've been paying aren't your father's, they're hush money to keep you compliant." The room tilted. Diana gripped the table edge, every payment she'd made suddenly reframed as extortion for a murder she hadn't known occurred. Her father hadn't died because he was weak. He'd died because he'd stumbled into Curtis Bravetti's war the same way she had. "I've been paying the man who murdered him," Diana whispered. "Yes," Petra said simply. Curtis stood, walking to the window overlooking the Chicago River. "At 9 p.m. tonight, I'm scheduled to meet Matteo and 3 Volkova captains at Pier 47 for what they believe is a debt settlement negotiation. They expect me to arrive with 2 bodyguards and a briefcase full of capitulation. Instead, I'm bringing 30 men and enough firepower to reduce that pier to kindling." He turned back to Diana. "Matteo's plan was elegant. Mine will be efficient." Diana found herself standing without remembering the decision to rise. "Why save me? I'm nobody to you. A waitress who overheard a conversation. You could have let them kill me and eliminated the witness problem yourself." Curtis crossed the space between them with 3 measured steps. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the words feel like confession. "You were the only person in my world who acted without motive. No debt to repay. No favor to earn. No fear compelling you. You risked your life for mine because you thought it was the right thing to do. That makes you more dangerous than my enemies, Miss Koontz, because loyalty I can't buy or coerce is loyalty I can't predict, and unpredictable variables in my world usually get people killed. He paused, and something almost human flickered across his expression. You saved my life. That creates a debt I can't ignore, but it also creates one you can't escape. At 8:45 p.m., Curtis left for Pier 47, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Diana's annual rent, and carrying violence in every controlled movement. His men followed in vehicles that blended into Chicago traffic like shadows. Diana remained in the safe house, watching the city lights through bulletproof glass, wondering if the napkin she'd written had saved Curtis Brevetti, or simply guaranteed that when he went to war, she'd be standing close enough to burn. Outside, Chicago glittered with beautiful indifference. And somewhere on the waterfront, men were about to die because a waitress had decided that silence was worse than risk. Diana pressed her palm against the cold glass and waited for the violence to find its conclusion. Pier 47 sat on the edge of Chicago's industrial waterfront like a forgotten tooth in the city's smile. At 9:00 p.m., 3 black SUVs arrived carrying Viktor Volkov, his brother Alexei, and their most trusted captain, along with Matteo Grimshaw, who wore his betrayal like a well-tailored suit. Curtis Brevetti stepped out of the darkness alone, hands visible, posture relaxed. He looked like a man who'd accepted defeat with dignity. Victor smiled, the kind of smile that preceded ownership. "Mr. Brevetti," Victor called across the empty pier. "You understand the terms? $8 million or 8 years of service. Your choice, but either way, you belong to us now." Matteo stood beside Victor with the satisfied expression of a man who'd executed a perfect strategy. 7 years of loyalty traded for a Volkova payout that would set him up for life. He'd dismantled Curtis's empire piece by piece, and now he'd watch his former boss kneel. Curtis stopped 15 feet away. "I understand the terms perfectly." Then he raised his right hand. The pier exploded into chaos. 30 men emerged from shipping containers, from behind concrete pillars, from positions they'd held for 2 hours in absolute silence. The Volkova's 8 bodyguards never had a chance to draw weapons before the first volley cut through them like surgical strikes. Viktor Volkov went down with 3 rounds in his chest before his brain processed the ambush. Alexei managed to pull his gun before Curtis's man put him on the ground permanently. The Volkova captain tried to run and made it exactly 7 steps. Matteo dove behind an SUV, weapon drawn, finally understanding that the trap he'd engineered had reversed. Curtis walked toward him with the unhurried pace of inevitability while gunfire echoed across the waterfront. "You knew!" Matteo shouted over the chaos. "How did you know?" Curtis rounded the SUV and found Matteo pressed against the driver's side door, gun trembling in his hands. "A waitress wrote me a note. 9 words that bought me 12 hours. 12 hours to verify what you'd done. 12 hours to prepare." Matteo's gun hand steadied. For 7 years, he'd been Curtis's most trusted bodyguard. He knew how Curtis moved, how he thought, where he kept his vulnerabilities. He raised the weapon with professional efficiency. Curtis shot him through the right shoulder before Matteo could fire. The gun clattered to the concrete. Matteo collapsed against the SUV, clutching his bleeding shoulder, and Curtis crouched beside him with the cold focus of a surgeon examining a failed procedure. "Why?" Curtis asked simply. Matteo laughed, blood speckling his lips. "Because you thought loyalty could be bought. The Volkovas understood it's rented, not owned. They offered me more than money, Curtis. They offered me respect." "Respect," Curtis repeated flatly. "You never saw me. 7 years watching your back, and you never once asked my opinion, my thoughts, whether I had ambitions beyond standing in your shadow." Matteo coughed, grimacing. "The Volkovas saw potential. You saw a bodyguard." Curtis stood. "The Volkovas saw a useful idiot. I saw what you were, competent enough to keep around, dangerous enough to watch. I just didn't watch closely enough." Mateo's expression shifted as he realized his confession wouldn't earn him mercy. The Volkovas have others in your organization. Kill me, and you've solved nothing. They've been planning this for 3 years. I was just the opening move. Then I'll find the others, Curtis said, one by one, until there's no one left to betray me. You can't kill everyone who disappoints you. Curtis raised his gun. Watch me. The shot echoed across the pier, final and absolute. Mateo Grimshaw slumped against the SUV, 7 years of service ending in a pool of his own blood beside Chicago's industrial waterfront. The gunfire had ceased. Curtis's men moved through the pier with tactical efficiency, confirming bodies, securing weapons, erasing evidence. 30 men against 11. The mathematics had been brutal and one-sided. Curtis walked to the pier's edge, looking out at the black water that had witnessed Chicago's violence for 100 years. He'd reclaimed his empire tonight, eliminated the Volkova threat. Proven that Curtis Bravetti couldn't be owned or controlled or turned into someone else's asset. But the cost stared up at him from the concrete. 8 bodies, including a man he'd trusted for 7 years. The blood debt was paid in full, the empire was secure, and somewhere across the city, Diana Koontz waited in a safe house, the woman whose 9 words had made this massacre possible. Curtis holstered his weapon and turned from the water. His men were already cleaning the scene with the efficiency of practice. By morning, Pier 47 would show no evidence of tonight's reckoning. The Volkovas would know better than to move against him again. Mateo's betrayal would become a cautionary tale whispered in Chicago's underworld. But one choice remained. One variable Curtis couldn't eliminate or control or predict. The waitress who'd saved his life now knew too much, had seen too much, existed too deep inside his world to ever truly leave it. Curtis pulled out his phone and made a call. Is she still at the safe house? He asked. Yes, sir, she hasn't tried to leave. Curtis ended the call and climbed into his vehicle, leaving Pier 47 behind as his men finished erasing the night's violence from Chicago's waterfront. Diana Koontz had created a debt that couldn't be repaid with money or protection or even gratitude, and Curtis Bravetti always settled his debts. The question was whether settling this one would save her or destroy her. Curtis returned to the safe house at 11:47 p.m. with blood on his cuffs and exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. Diana stood by the window where she'd been standing for 3 hours, watching Chicago's lights and wondering if he'd survive his own war. When he entered, she turned. Their eyes met across the room, and something shifted in the space between them. Relief, recognition, the dangerous gravity of 2 people who'd altered each other's trajectories irrevocably. It's done, Curtis said simply. He moved to the bar, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and handed her one without asking if she wanted it. Mateo's dead. The Volkovas are broken. My empire is secure. Diana took the glass with trembling hands. And me? Curtis studied her with that assessing gaze she'd come to recognize. Calculating, weighing options, making decisions that would determine lives. You have 2 choices, he said. First, I give you $2 million, a new identity, and transport to anywhere in the world you want to disappear to. By tomorrow night, Diana Koontz ceases to exist, and you become someone who never wrote a warning on a cocktail napkin. Diana's throat tightened. And the second choice? You stay in Chicago, return to Celestia, live your life as if nothing happened, but you do it under my protection, which means under my control. Your apartment, your job, your safety, all of it exists because I allow it to exist. You belong to my world now, Miss Koontz. The only question is whether you acknowledge it or run from it. That's not a choice, Diana whispered. That's captivity dressed up as options. Curtis moved closer, and Diana could smell gunpowder and expensive cologne. You saved my life. I owe you everything. Protection, gratitude, resources I'd never extend to anyone else. But you owe me too. You stepped into my world. You saw what I am. You know what I've done. That knowledge makes you either an asset or a liability, and I don't leave liabilities walking around free. Diana set down the scotch, her hands steadier than she expected. So I choose between running forever or being owned. You choose between isolation and connection, between starting over with nothing but money or staying in a city you know, with someone who understands exactly what you risked. Curtis paused, and something almost vulnerable flickered across his expression. I'm not offering freedom, Diana. I'm offering something more dangerous, a place in my life, protection that comes with a price, the certainty that you'll never be alone again, even when you want to be. Diana looked at him, this man who'd killed 8 people tonight, who controlled Chicago's underworld with strategic violence, who'd saved her life and then told her she could never truly leave. I need time, she said. You have 3 days, Curtis replied. Then I need an answer. 3 days later, on a Thursday at 8 o'clock sharp, Curtis Brevetti sat at table 17 in Celestia. The terrace hummed with its familiar rhythm of wealth and elegance. Chicago's skyline glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling glass, like diamonds scattered across black velvet. He'd been sitting there for 7 minutes when he saw her. Diana emerged from the kitchen in her server uniform, hair pulled back, posture professional. She moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, delivering menus, refilling water glasses, performing the role she'd played for months before everything changed. When she reached table 17 thus, she set down a bone-dry martini with 3 olives exactly as he preferred it. Their eyes met. Curtis saw her answer in the slight tremor of her hands, in the way she held his gaze without looking away, in the simple fact that she'd walked through Celestia's doors knowing he'd be waiting. "Welcome back, Mr. Brevetti," Diana said quietly. 2 words that meant everything. She wasn't running. She wasn't disappearing into a new identity somewhere safe and far away. She was staying in Chicago, in his world, in the dangerous orbit of a man who could protect her or destroy her with equal efficiency. Curtis nodded, accepting what she'd given him. "Thank you, Miss Koontz." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and Curtis watched her go. This woman who'd proven that loyalty, real loyalty, couldn't be bought or coerced or manufactured. It could only be given freely, which made it the rarest and most dangerous thing in his world. Diana had chosen to stay. She'd chosen him, or perhaps chosen the devil she knew over the uncertainty of running. Either way, she'd bound herself to Curtis Brevetti in ways that transcended employment or debt or even gratitude. She'd saved his life with 9 words on a napkin. He'd saved hers with 30 men and brutal violence. The debts between them could never be truly settled, only acknowledged and carried forward into whatever came next. Diana returned with his water, setting it down with the careful precision of someone maintaining control. Curtis noticed the way she avoided looking directly at him, the slight tension in her shoulders, the evidence that she understood exactly what her choice meant. She'd stepped out of one cage, the endless cycle of her father's debts and Tannen's extortion, and into another. This one was larger, more comfortable, infinitely more dangerous. Curtis Brevetti didn't own her in the legal sense, but he owned her safety, her future, the space she occupied in Chicago's dangerous ecosystem. And Diana didn't know yet if she regretted it. Chicago's skyline glittered outside the terrace windows as Diana poured wine for the man who was both her salvation and her captor, and Curtis watched the woman who'd changed everything, because once loyalty is given to a man like Curtis Brevetti, it can never be taken back.